So you've got the pyramids acting like giant engines that are powering these temples that people are coming to receive healing, fertility. And then you've got these smaller engines. If you Google Osirian of Abydos, this is one of the most incredible, it's underground, subterranean structures. And Muhammad is convinced that that was powering the Great Pyramids. Powering the Great Pyramids.
Hey, welcome back to Blurry Creatures. Thanks for tuning in to our podcast. We have a free episode every week, but for members, you get extra bonus content. And we have a lot of perks for members. Tonight, we have a members chat, Tuesday, April 26th. So tonight, we're going to be talking with you guys on a Zoom call. And you also get access to unreleased episodes. We have an episode coming out this week where two sisters saw a werewolf creature dead on the side of the road and a Bigfoot when they were hunting. So got some crazy stories from you guys, members out there. So if you want to support the show, blurrycreatures.com/members. We're going to bring Derek Olson on from Megalithic Marvels to talk about the Enigmas of Egypt today. Thank you guys so much for supporting this podcast.
The history of our Earth is so different from what we can imagine.
The Smithsonian, if they found out about a large skeleton somewhere, was to go get it.
I'm going to assume at least one person is right, because if one person's right, it busts the paradigm.
It all goes back to the fallen cherub. And the problem with the modern day church, they have a very truncated view of the supernatural.
This backdrop that's just pregnant with all kinds of meaning associated with this Mount Hermon event.
Welcome to Blurry Creatures.
And this guy defects from the kingdom. That's a big deal.
Welcome back to Blurry Creatures, the Mega Man. You got to do an episode with the D.O., Derek Olson, right? Right there, Luke?
Dude, triple digits. Look at, dude, episode 101.
101.
Dude, with M squared, Megalithic Marvels.
That's right.
Dude, the legend. He almost stayed out in Egypt. We got him back. Got him out of Instagram prison. Got him back from Egypt.
That's right.
Here.
He's wearing a Blurry Creatures tee, guys.
I really am. And I'll put the camera down if this is ever on video so people can see proof that I am wearing Blurry Creatures, officially representing the best podcast out there.
Oh, you say that to all the cute boys on the shows out there, huh?
That is the wrong show for that.
I have got a lot of friends and family that are big fans of this show now, and not because I'm ever on, just because I've said, hey, you should check out Blurry Creatures, and they get hooked, man. Talking about just such an array, a plethora of subjects.
We love it, man. It's been wild. It's been a great, coming on 2 years, 100 episodes. You're 101. We love having you on, man, because we talk a lot about the Golden Age. We talk a lot about the blurry creatures who built the dynasties, and it's one of the main things we have proof for, that these giants or cyclops or whatever they were building these anomalies that, you can go put your hands on. And you went down the Nile and put your hands on them, baby. And we want to hear about it.
I did. And I got to tell you guys, one of the best experiences of my life was literally floating down the Nile in this open air luxury yacht, sipping Turkish coffee in a hammock with a gentle breeze.
You're rubbing it in now, Derek.
A gentle breeze literally blowing over you, and you're looking out at ancient ruins along the cliffs. It was incredible.
Dang.
If you ever go to Egypt, you got to go on a Nile River cruise.
Did you have a plate of hummus and some Mediterranean olives?
Seriously, we did. Again, this was probably the favorite part of our trip, because so we got this special deal through our tour guide Mohammed with this yacht. A lot of tours are on giant boats that are not open air, but this had the rooms downstairs, and then up above was this coffee bar and cots. It was amazing. So it was an amazing trip for people who have never experienced Cairo traffic. That in itself is a lifetime experience. Cairo, I think, has 20 million plus people in it. It's literally like ants on top of each other. And so getting from the airport when you arrive to your hotel, going through Cairo traffic, you've never experienced anything like it. It makes LA traffic look easy.
I'm guessing it's just like buses and scooters and bikes and everything's just going wild.
Serious. An occasional donkey with, pulling somebody. I mean, and it's literally every man for himself. No rules at all. But the craziest thing is it's like symbiotic beauty. Like you would think, and within 5 minutes, you'd see 100 car crashes and a couple deaths. I didn't see one, not one fender bender. It's like everybody flexes and flows with everybody, but you think you're going to get hit every second.
That's awesome. I spent about a week in Kabul, Afghanistan in 2017, and driving in Kabul, I imagine, was pretty much the same. It's like there are no lanes. If you have 2 lanes, you've got 4 wide, and everybody is somehow they don't get in wrecks, but everybody is moving. It's like a 3-man weave in basketball, Nate. Like everybody's just kind of going in front of each other. But I want to catch people up in case you're tuning in now. Derek went to Egypt with Megalithic Marvels almost 2 weeks in February of this year, and so we've been waiting to kind of catch up and unpack some of the things that he discovered. But he took a tour through Megalithic Marvels, which is his project, his site, and you guys really went to you went to ground zero in a lot of ways for the people to understand, megaliths. I know we talk about Göbekli Tepe and these other places that may be older, but the iconic idea of megaliths, or maybe the idea of the image that comes up is it has to be, Giza and the pyramids, and we're excited to have you back and kind of unpack some of the things you saw. And Nate was right. Like we talk a lot about on this show about the hidden, the mystery, the untold history. And I love these episodes because I love history, but I love to unpack the alternate history that we're not taught, the things and the evidence for things that run counter to the narrative that we're fed. And Egypt is really that place. Like, there's so many enigmas there. I feel like when you're looking at the record that's in stone, and and it's not unlike the things that we have in I feel like in just mainstream culture. There's this mainstream narrative that's pushed, and someone's in control of that narrative. And there's there's an Egyptology. There's people in Egypt. There's a state-run Egyptology department that kind of pushes their preferred narrative. So I'm excited about this. I think, Nate, one of the things we talk about is technology and the transaction we talk about for technology that happened on Mount Hermon, right? In Genesis 6, where we live with our podcast. And I know that we're going to talk a little bit about ancient technology and sort of the evidence for that stuff, because, if we're to surmise, and Alberino, we talked to Tim about this, that perhaps the washers showed up in ships, and with the UFO disclosure, right? I mean, we're just connecting all the dots here. I love this because we're going forward and backward.
100 episode recap.
Yeah, we're just going to do it all here. Just the big guy. The big guy's out there. He's sand colored. He's still hiding.
And things probably were blurry for you, Derek, but then you go there and everything comes into focus, right? You get to see it firsthand. Luke's about to be a dad. I've been dad for a while, so dad jokes are
it's good.
They just flow like wine. Tell us, what's it like putting your hands on the stones, seeing them?
It was incredible. It literally was the trip of a lifetime. I think most of these tours are no more than 12 days. Ours was 16. And so literally it was like a megalithic Marvels buffet. I mean, you're seeing 2, 3, sometimes 4 sites a day. Like by the end of the day, you're hiking and climbing way more than you think, is a lot of times in the heat. And so you're just beat by the end of the day. And a little bit, unfortunately for me, one of my main objectives was to capture as much content as possible, especially video for Instagram Reels and stuff. And so I probably wasn't in the present like I wanted to be. In a perfect world, a lot of people were just sitting there and they're getting to hear Muhammad, our tour guide, lecture at different spots. And I'm just running around trying to capture this and that. So it literally was blurry. It was a blur, man, but it was amazing. Luke, you mentioned, kind of the mainstream cover up a little bit there. And a lot of listeners to your show are familiar with, the fact that mainstream history has taught us to believe that ancient times equal primitive times, right? That the further you look back, the more archaic the ancients were, the dumber we were. But we know, one trip to Egypt will unequivocally prove that is not the case. It's the opposite, that the further we look back, the more advanced the ancients were, that they had technology to build stuff that we cannot replicate today with our greatest technologies.
How do you walk amongst all these, what's left over, and have that opinion? How do you not see what you've seen and think that, do people just see this stuff and then automatically in their mind and their heart, they think there's no way that human beings could build this without advanced mathematics and all the other things that go through your mind? I just wonder, is it just because a lot of people haven't seen it and that's why these terrible theories continue to barrel on decade after decade?
Yeah, exactly. Most people have not been to Egypt and literally not only seen this stuff, because you can go there and see this stuff and still be blind, but it's going there with somewhat of an open mind to look at the evidence. And that's what we're going to get in today. I sent you guys a bunch of pictures. Yeah. One example is on one of the last days of our tour, we went to the Egyptian Museum in Cairo. There's all kinds of artifacts in there. Again, where it gets confusing is you're going to have dynastic stuff, and then you're going to have megalithic stuff mixed in, right? Mm-hmm. And mainstream Egyptology tells us, well, the dynastics just built all this.
And for listeners, can you tell us what dynastic versus megalithic means really quick?
Yes, great question. So Egyptology kind of calls them the pharaonic dynasties, the pharaohs, whether that was Tut or Khufu or Khafre. These guys all lived about 3,200 BC to 300 BC. So that kind of gives you the time frame of the dynasties, 3,200 to 300 BC. Mainstream Egyptology tells us that they created the pyramids as tombs, and that everything you see in Egypt that's cool was made by them. And before the dynasties, they call it the pre-dynastic period, which they say was really just a bunch of primitive people walking around. Mm-hmm. So, but when you get to Egypt, you realize there's a whole lot more going on. So at the Egyptian Museum, again, you'll see really cool, and I want to start off by saying the dynastic Egyptians were amazing. What they built was incredible. And so when I allude to the megalithic, that's not to down the dynastic Egyptians. It's just looking at the facts and the evidence that there is something as cool as the dynastic stuff is. There's something far greater. Again, for example, at this Egyptian museum in Cairo, you see all these artifacts. And but again, once you go to Egypt, and if you have a guide like Muhammad Ibrahim, or you come with Megalithic Marvels, it's like you put on your megalithic goggles and you start to see the stuff that jumps out in contrast to the inferior stuff. So like at that museum is this probably a 50-ton rectangle granite box. I sent you guys 2 pictures.
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
And if you look at the left side, you can see this ancient megalithic architect literally had some kind of saw where he was literally shearing off that side, and then he stopped for some reason. And you can see from the top down, it is a precision, almost laser looking cut. Right? So the problem is the dynastics could not have done this because according to the archaeological record, they had copper chisels and hammers. And copper is a much softer material than rose granite, which is the hardest, most pristine type of granite. It's got a bunch of quartz in there. And so copper can't cut through quartz, number one. And number two, a chisel and a hammer can't make such a precise cut like that, right?
Right, without chisel marks, right? Without, you would see, like the shaping. It's like like if you see a sculpture that's been chiseled, and it's usually not out of rose granite. I find this fascinating because I know we talked about this before, but it's like you have to have in our terms of technology, you would have had to have like a diamond tip saw, like a circular
huge one.
saw,
a huge
big one.
I'm looking at this. You would need like a 5-foot one.
Yeah, and what's amazing is if you walked around, if I showed you a picture of the other side of that, so when you walk around to the right side of that 50-ton megalithic stone, literally the inside is cut out in a perfect rectangle. So the inside is all taken out. And you know how they did it by looking at the left side, which shows the evidence of this ancient tool, right? They literally were able to cut it with ease. So they didn't need blunt force. Like you said, Luke, blunt force would have showed chisel marks and all kinds of stress. This is, you're not seeing stress.
So do you think, Derek, because the dynastics still had some leftover tech from the Golden Age?
I do believe the dynastics had remnants of some knowledge of the lost technology.
Okay.
But if they had it all, they would have most likely made everything, or at least a lot more, like that stone box. Because what we see is you go to all these megalithic temples or these dynastic temples, and you'll see the majority of the site, 75% at least, is made of dynastic sandstone, which is much softer. All the columns and walls are made in sections. The hieroglyphs look more crude. And then you'll look around and you'll see a megalithic artifact or statue that is precision carved out of one piece, right? So if it was the dynastics, why didn't they make everything out of the superior form, right? Another thing to point out is, a lot of people talk about the King's List, and this is kind of one of the main sources that Egyptology uses to get their dating, as Muhammad Ibrahim would say, and he's an Egyptologist as well. So this guy is very studied, amazing tour guide, knows the region, grew up there, has been doing tours for 20 years. But he makes the point, the problem with Egyptology is that they choose to use what they want and don't want. For example, there's another King's List that's kind of was written in the Greco-Roman times by a guy named Manethan. And he says in his King's List that the first ruler of Egypt was from 36,000 BC. And Egyptologists say, well, he was just exaggerating. But then you go to, there's another cool museum called the Civilization Museum in Cairo. And there we saw this skeleton that's carbon dated at 35,000 years old. And so it just blows your mind to know that the history in Egypt is so much more ancient than we know. There's just so much there. So I can talk on forever, but I don't want to say too much on it. You guys got lots of questions.
I mean, it makes you think about just like how knowledge can be lost in 100 years, let alone even just some of the like more just old school, like people had, Native Americans had, things they would do when they would get sick, and they would take these herbs, and they had this, just simple things can get lost, and you just wonder, like, a couple hundred years can go by and a lot of this technology gets lost, but it's like someone knew their grandpa and they still had a remnants of it, but it just seems to slowly get worse. And we have this idea that things are getting better. But one thought I had when you were talking, Derek, is that like ancient people, did you think that like the way that modern human beings show off now, we have our Lamborghinis or whatever we do to show off, but ancient people, how do you think they showed off? Like, say you're in the middle of a dynastic period. I mean, you look at the ancient stuff and it's just incredible. I mean, it's going to make you feel inferior. Like, man, how are these people so much smarter than us? We have to rival them. We have to challenge them. It's kind of like a competition. Like our ancients were so smart. You feel stupid almost if you can't recreate or build this stuff, right? Do you think that there was some ego going on? And
That's great. Actually, I do. And so one example I'll give you, I think I sent you guys some photos of a site called the Ramesseum. This is much further south than the Cairo area. This is near Luxor. And so on our tour, just so people can understand, we spent a couple of days at first in the Cairo area, Giza, looking at the Great Pyramids. Then we went north to Tanis, which is a real rare spot, several hour drive, a long drive. So a lot of people don't get to see that. That was incredible. I sent you guys some pictures from Tanis, and there are what I believe are megalithic statues and symbols. I can talk more about that. But then we went back down, jumped on a plane, flew to Luxor. And from Luxor, we got on a boat and sailed all the way down to Aswan, where we saw a lot of these sites I'm about to reference. So the Ramesseum was one of them down near Luxor. And mainstream Egyptology says, well, this is the memorial temple for Ramses II. He was from the 19th dynasty. So he ruled from like 1300 to 1200 BC. And they call it, the Ramesseum because they say the name Ramses was first identified on some hieroglyphs around in the 1800s. And when you go to this site, you see large sandstone pillars, walls. They're built in sections. You see some cool statues of Ramses, but you notice they're all made in sections. And all this is great until you see something greater, something far more mesmerizing. And I think I sent you guys pictures of this at the Ramesseum. There is a 1,000-ton solid piece of Aswan rose granite that is a statue made from one solid piece. It's been damaged, so all you kind of see is the piece of the neck and torso. But that alone still weighs 1,000 tons. So at one point, it probably weighed 2,000 tons. And so this stone that was used to make this one solid precision cut statue was quarried 3.5 hours away by car down from Aswan. So that's another story. So you have this giant statue, and the official plaque at the entrance of the site, it actually shows a 1,000-ton block that's being moved by 11 men during a previous excavation there. So picture that, 11 men to move 1 ton. And we're talking about 1,000-ton statue. And Muhammad Ibrahim says he's seen these Egyptologists working, or scientists, and it takes them at least 2 hours to move a 1-ton block 10 meters. Right? So if you keep the calculations, it would require an astounding army of like 11,000 guys to transport this 1,000-ton megalithic statue. But if you go to the site, you see there's only space and dimension for like 200 guys to move it. This 1,000-ton megalithic statue. This 1,000-ton megalithic statue. This 1,000-ton megalithic statue. So you start to kind of see all these problems, right, with the mainstream theory. And so you see that giant statue, and then you also see this greenish Ramses head. Did you guys see that?
Yeah.
This thing, if you look close, you look into its ears, you literally see what look like laser cuts, okay? So, and then you've got these incredible 3D precision crafted sunken hieroglyphs on the shoulders of that massive statue, at the base of the statue, that talk about Muhammad interpreted them for us. It says like chosen by the sun, son of the sun, Ramses, right? So again, the dynastic Egyptians were great, but what I think is going on here, Nate, to answer your question, is they found a much older megalithic temple and site here, right? And they are blown away by this, by the power of the technology they used. And so what I think we're looking at is that, that Ramses II of the 19th dynasty couldn't have precision carved these, again, with softer chisels and hammers made of copper. That's akin to cutting wood with a plastic knife. So what we see here happening is he probably came upon the site, took upon the name of Ramses, right? Because again, this is 1300 BC. These people are much closer to the golden age than we are today. They still have more of fragments of the lost knowledge. And so they probably knew a lot more of this Titan Ramses. So he probably took upon the name, tagged the site, with his name, and then built around it with all the sandstone columns, walls, and other statues that are literally made in sections because they couldn't make it all out of one precision crafted section, if that makes sense. What do you think of that?
Yeah.
Dude,
no, I mean,
crazy.
It makes sense because, as time goes on, you still want to feel like, oh yeah, we're still hanging on to the good old days. We're still hanging on to the 80s, Luke. You know what I mean? But you just can't make it like Grandpa made it. And then it just becomes sort of a, I like how you said tag. Just tag Ramses on there. Yeah, I built this stuff, It's just fascinating to me that modern people who have college degrees can go and look at this stuff. Like you said, there's not even enough space around these statues for 300 guys to get around to lift it. So even if there was 10,000 guys available, you can't all get a hand on it. So how do they move it? How do they get it up? How does it get put into place? Or even some of the stuff just looks like wood carvings. I mean, it's so perfect. It's like they're chiseled straight out of malleable stone.
It's like they 3D printed it. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. And so what you see in Egypt is you see, and this is where it's easy to get confused. Again, a lot of people, and we had to help Muhammad understand that a lot of people in the West, in America, they've been fed a diet of history that makes them believe that, again, the pyramids were just made by the pharaohs as tombs and that the pharaohs themselves were all buried in there. Well, you find out real quick that's not the case when you see the scale of Egypt and you realize that the Valley of the Kings is hours and hours away from the pyramids, right? And then you see where the dynastic pharaohs were buried, and it's far inferior architecture, these tombs that go into the side of a hill, than when you look at this megalithic pyramid, right? That's precision crafted and feels almost mechanical inside. And so that's what you see in Egypt. You see this repurposing. It's kind of both and. These originally were megalithic, but yes, you had the dynastics come thousands upon thousands of years later, repurpose them, tag them. They probably did bury some of their people in them, right? Because this was the greatest structure that they could honor the fallen in, right? And so another thing to point out is I sent you guys pictures from the Aswan Quarry. And this to me was one of the greatest smoking guns of advanced tech, of a megalithic civilization that predated the dynastic Egyptians, as great as they were. Here's what's crazy. This is 11 hours by car south of the Great Pyramids. Okay. All of the rose granite that you see in Egypt that's in the Great Pyramids and in the megalithic temples came from Aswan. So again, from the pyramids in Egypt, I believe that's about 11 hours away.
Dang.
By car. So that's a whole nother thing we can get into in a second, is how did they get all of this 11 hours, right? Number one, how do you cut it? Yeah. How do you fashion precision? Number two, how do you move this 11 hours? Right? So at Aswan.
And how much are we talking about? How much stone are we talking about moving?
Oh, I mean, Well, for example, the Valley Temple, that whole thing is made of rose granite. And you guys will see the pictures I sent there to you of me standing with Muhammad in front of the Valley Temple. It's right by the Sphinx.
Mm-hmm.
This is what we would call a megalithic temple. It's the same megalithic mortarless precision architecture, but that whole thing is rose granite. So again, we're talking, if one stone might be 100 tons, and this thing is massive. So we're talking tens of thousands, if not more tons, right?
Mm-hmm.
So at Aswan, you see the unfinished obelisk lying there, made of rose granite. It's like 5 meters long. It weighs 1,200 tons. Why was it never finished?
Mm-hmm.
Lots of people theorize, well, it's because it was cracked. And you can see it is cracked, but it's almost finished. And Muhammad makes so many great points, Muhammad Ibrahim, our tour guide, that the crack on the top might have happened at a later date, maybe to an earthquake. But despite the crack, about 75% of it appears not to be cracked. So it could still have been removed and used as a valuable piece of material. Right? I'm into construction. Nate, I know you are at times. And so you don't leave valuable material behind. So why was it left? But you can see in this core that more than one civilization quarried here. There's at least 2 distinct methods that have been used. You can see one using tools where there's scrape marks and small chisel squares. And then there's the scooping method. So again, people will see the chisel squares that the dynastics were making, and they're just going to assume up, see, there's dynastic chisel marks. So this proves that the dynastics were here. Yes, they were here, but somebody else was here. When you look at the scoop marks, you guys see those pictures?
Yeah, I'm looking at it.
So a lot of people talk about the unfinished obelisk, but behind it is this smaller obelisk where you can literally walk down underneath it and around. And again, this is rose granite made with a bunch of quartz, some of the hardest material on the Mohs scale of hardness. And it's been scooped out like ice cream. And the scoop marks are like about 1 meter wide on both sides of the obelisk. And you can see, if you follow the scoop marks up in different pictures, I don't think I sent them to you, but there's literally reddish vertical lines that are on the walls that lead down into the scoops, which is like almost a sign of excessive heat, maybe from an ultrasonic type tool. So again, there's not only the mystery of how this was shaped, what was this tool that was like reaching down, scooping this granite out, but then how are they moving it all over with ease across Egypt? For comparison's sake, I did a little research in 2008. China made a giant industrial super crane named the Tyson, and it set the world record for heaviest weight lifted by a crane with 20,100 tons. Okay, so 2008, our greatest industrial super crane could only lift 20,000 plus tons. How did the ancient architects move these blocks, right?
Yeah. I mean, it probably gets frustrating after a while, I could imagine. It's kind of like on our podcast, people come on and they say there's no evidence for Bigfoot, right? And after 2 years of listening to people talk about it, it's like, just because you haven't looked into it doesn't mean there's no evidence. So what about you, Derek? What do you think? Like, as you've been doing this for a while and you've been pondering these questions and you've been looking at this stuff, like permission to get weird. What do you think? How is your thoughts of how they made this evolved
and moved it?
Like, what do you think? What's your best guess?
Yeah, to set this up, one of my biggest revelations from this trip was geology. Now, I'm not a geologist, but I know people who are. Muhammad Ibrahim, our tour guide, helped us realize how much geology plays such a part in this, because so much of this is holistic. These ancients knew how to tap into the power of the earth. And so when you look, for example, at some of the stone used to make the Great Pyramid, You've got the rose granite inside, which makes up like the most amazing parts of the pyramid, the king's chamber, the so-called king's chamber, I should say, the so-called queen's chamber. This is all rose granite from Aswan, again, 11 hours away. It contains 20 to 60% quartz. And if you start to study rose granite, it's Muhammad says it's radioactive stone. Its ingredients can almost like send and receive waves, almost like radio waves, right? Well, then covering that is limestone. When you start to study limestone, it's a conductive material. It absorbs negative energies and pollution, and it almost plays like an electrical current for granite, right? So again, if these are tombs, which let me just state in case some listeners don't know this, no hieroglyphs have ever been found in any of the great pyramids or the truly megalithic pyramids of Egypt. And no mummies have ever been found in them either, right? So that a lot of people, it's surprising how many people don't know that. So if these were just tombs, why are they layering it with these specific stones that have specific properties to do specific things, right? That's one thing. Another thing is like walk around the outside of the Great Pyramid. On the first full day of our trip, we begin exploring around the Great Pyramid. You immediately start to see all of these anomalies. And if I lose track of my train of thought here, just pull me back, guys. But that sparked me, like a lot of people don't realize they're so like caught up looking up at the pyramids, they're not looking down. And one thing that blew my mind is the floor around the Great Pyramid. It is not just dirt or bedrock. It is a constructed stone megalithic floor. It's white. And I sent you guys a picture. I think there's like, I took a picture of an 8-sided stone that looks like you're looking at a wall in Peru. It's beautiful. And this is just the floor. And so you've got this kind of stuff going on. You keep walking around and you'll notice that in this white flooring, you'll see places where these blocks have turned into like bubbled over crystals. They call it rock crystal. And Muhammad, again, back to geology, I think that's where I was going. This was originally limestone, but because this limestone was exposed to so much extreme heat and pressure at one point, it literally changed its structure into rock crystal. And so it was wild to see this megalithic, mortarless blocks in the floor that looked like they'd been bubbled over. And obviously it was due to extreme heat. So that points back to cataclysm, right? So geology plays a huge part in why these were made and how they were made.
So yeah, I mean, you talk about the obelisk not being finished. You talk about some of those bubbles on the floor. It sounds like something, perhaps not a flood, but a cataclysm that wasn't maybe extreme heat, like a Sodom and Gomorrah type event or something like that happen, you think?
Possibly. Yeah. And maybe, meteor, that's one of, a lot of people talk about the evidence of a global cataclysm happening somewhere around 12,500 years ago. I know that can sound wild to some people, but when you kind of start looking at the dating of stuff, I think we've talked about before in other episodes about the Great Sphinx and the great research done by Robert Schoch. Again, mainstream Egyptology tells us that Khafre, I believe, built the Sphinx around 2500 BC. But when you start to look closer at the Sphinx and the walls around it, its enclosure, there's all kinds of water erosion. Well, this is the desert. How could that be? And so when you start looking into, as a geologist, when that much rain was, it was a long time ago, right? And so Schock believes the Sphinx from the end of the last ice age, 10,000 BC. And so you start to hear those dates. We know Göbekli Tepe is ancient. Graham Hancock talks about that. Its first stones were laid about 11,600 years ago at the end of what they call the Younger Dryas. And so if you look into what Plato wrote about Atlantis, the approximate date Plato gives us for the submergence of Atlantis, he said was 9,000 years before Solon of Greece visited Egypt. And if you do the research, that visit took place around 600 BC. So Plato is telling us that Atlantis was submerged 9,600 BC, 11,600 years ago. Now, a lot of people hear Atlantis and they think, man, that's just make-believe fairy tale stuff. But the more I research, the more I believe that was likely, a golden age megalithic city, or one that kind of was an example of the golden age. So does that answer your question, Nate?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, it sounds like the golden age was a lot longer and further back, maybe 10,000, 20,000 years. Sounds like a long time. The more our show barrels on, it doesn't seem like it was a short.
I think it's interesting too. In the beginning, you talked about a skeleton being carbon dated, and I immediately thought of the Sphinx, right? That there's all this research about what, and it didn't rain, and it was at it was something like 16,000 BC. The Nile Valley actually was experiencing rain. I mean, quote me if that's wrong. It's something in that range where you're like, well, yeah, of course there were things there before. Like the geology speaks to, and that's why I like what you're saying. The geology actually speaks to the narrative, to the true narrative about what things were going on. And we did have an episode with the pyramid. We were talking about the pyramids with you before, previous in our catalog here. And one of the things you sent over as well was the idea of an energy charging station. So going to Egypt, were you more convinced now that the pyramids were some sort of energy, like power plant sort of mechanism that was connected to what was happening in ISIS, at the energy charging base at ISIS? And talk through that, because we know, I think we can probably definitively say, based on all the evidence and what you've set before us, that they're not tombs. Like there's no hieroglyphics. These were repurposed. Some dynastic king came along and decided that they thought they were the most important. The pyramid of the pyramid of Khufu, where they decided he's going to get buried in there, right? But these were there already, right? They're in some ways the effigy of these mountains, which we can take back to Genesis 6. Depends on how you want to do that, but it appears as if these were based on what you're saying, conductivity, and then what we've talked about before. These were power plants. Can you talk about what you saw at ISIS and then what you saw in the pyramids that maybe expounded or made you think that could be a possibility?
Yeah, so great question, you guys. So in a nutshell, yes, I'm more convinced than ever that this was all relating to energy. We live the 21st century and we're really proud. We're led to believe by mainstream thought today that this is the height of civilization. We are the smartest that humans have ever been. We have cell phones, right? We have Teslas. But the reality is, I don't believe this is the smartest humankind has ever been. So when you look at the pyramids, they had a different kind of energy, a holistic energy. An energy they didn't need to blow stuff up to create this. They created stuff with ease. So as Muhammad would say, you've got kind of different kind of megalithic structures in Egypt. You've got the pyramids. You've got these megalithic temples. An example of that would be the Valley Temple. You've got the obelisks. And then you've got what could almost be like engines. Think of the Osirion of Abydos. I don't know if I sent you a picture of that. So let me break this down. So the pyramids, I believe, were likely producing some type of ancient holistic energy. So the pyramid, the purpose of this pyramid, think of like an ancient generator. It's powering these megalithic temples. The temples aren't as big as the pyramid, right? So the pyramid is almost like it's the big engine, and it's producing this holistic energy that's powering these megalithic temples. if you go to these megalithic temples, and I sent you guys some pictures of the Valley Temple, and there's a bunch of them, you can see these are made where they're functional for humans or ancient beings to walk through. The pyramid, not at all. That was one thing that blew my mind, climbing into the pyramid. They've got these wooden ramps with steps. Just me with a backpack. It was all I could do to climb up some of these 300-foot long flights, or coming down was even harder. I mean, you are bent over trying to climb down 300 feet. It's backbreaking, right? And this is just me. So that was one major thing that jumped out, is how in the world could this have been functional for a ceremonial burial with hundreds of people coming through with relics and statues?
That's like someone finding a Tesla to say today and 500 years from now and say, look at this flower bed I found. You know what I mean? Like, you have this $70,000 car, and the interpretation is they must have planted flowers in this thing. Some dumb hypothesis. I mean, you have this, it's obviously a tool. It's obviously it's a tool of some kind. It's not a mansion. It's not a tomb. Like you said, you can't even get in. Those videos you posted, man, they're claustrophobic. I was just like, dude, I couldn't. Yeah. I was like, I wouldn't go in there. I'd feel
freaking
so
out,
trapped.
man. I'm freaking out.
But seriously, it's you can. I mean, you don't have to be a genius to realize it's a tool. That's how I feel about it, though.
No, well said. It's a tool. I mean, again, it's not even functional to walk in these chambers, the ascending chambers and the descending chambers. So I say that to say the megalithic temples, like the Valley Temple, you can see where this is made to walk through. And so according to Muhammad and many other well-studied people, these megalithic temples, again, different than the pyramids, were made so that the ancients would come and receive healing for their bodies and for fertility. And even when you read the hieroglyphs of the dynastic Egyptians, these megalithic temples were still full of power, where they would come through even, 3,500 years ago to, fertility powers and receive healing for their bodies. And in these temples are sometimes either obelisks or what I called in that picture I sent you, energy charging bases, right? And so, again, I'll break that down more in a second. So you've got the pyramids acting like giant engines that are powering these temples that people are coming to receive healing, fertility. And then you've got these smaller engines. If you Google Osirian of Abydos, this is one of the most incredible, it's underground, subterranean structures. And Muhammad is convinced that was powering the Great Pyramids, right? So the Great Pyramids, they don't have endless power. So they're needing to be powered by these subterranean, almost machine-like structures. And again, when you look at the geology is different for the Osirian of Abydos. Here's why. It's this subterranean temple with 110 megalithic pillars made of rose granite. Again, granite's like plutonic. It's very strong against natural elements. So it's almost like the ancients were trying to protect the Osirian from energy blasts. And so it's likely that they were connected underground to the pyramids. So all this stuff, Muhammad was saying, oral tradition around the area from the guards he talks to, is that they find tunnels all over, ancient giant tunnels all over underground that are, of course, they're all blocked off. Normal people can't go in them. So it's almost like somehow these are connected, pyramids to the temples, to the engines. And I like what author Chris Dunn says. He wrote the Giza power plant. He believes that the Great Pyramid was originally built to provide a highly technical society with holistic energy that is somehow harmonically coupled with the earth. So I know I said a lot.
Yeah. It really brings up a good point, Derek, and what you think about because I mean, you see, if you do any research on like guys like Tesla and even some of the early inventors, we have a monopoly on energy, right? And if these ancient people like giants were bred into society and people had this advanced knowledge, it would be a lot harder to have a monopoly on energy, right? I mean, we have better technologies than fossil fuels, and we've had it for 100 years. But because, look at what they did to Tesla. I mean, he was figuring out things with electricity that were decades and decades in the future, and they basically took him out, shut him down. And human beings have, in the last 100 years, have sort of cornered the market on energy. And I feel like ancient people, they probably didn't look at it like that. You probably couldn't corner the energy market because it was everywhere. It was it was available. It was free. They just knew how to tap into it. I wonder if there's something there. There's a conversation there of how humans we manipulate things, we trademark it, and then we're at the top, and then nobody else can have any access. Well,
there absolutely is a conversation we can have about that. So when you go to, I do believe that the ancient original megalithic builders, I believe it was this free, holistic type energy that was powering this ancient civilization. It was helping the crops grow, right? It was providing healing and fertility for these ancients. I mean, when you look at life today, everybody's trying to not die. Everybody's trying to live longer, right? It's all about healthcare. It's all about anti-aging. It was the same with the ancients. But it's interesting, Nate, you bring that up because you absolutely see this at all of these megalithic temples. And let me talk now about the Isis temple with the energy charging base. For example, you go to this Isis temple, originally megalithic foundations, again, producing healing and energy. All of these temples now are surrounded by massive mud brick walls that are dated to the time of the dynastics. So Muhammad was literally telling us that it's like about 9,500 BC, when these cataclysms were happening, the power to these, a lot of them kind of shut off, but there was still limited energy you could receive. And so when the dynastics arrived, they literally built these mud brick walls around all these healing centers because that like holds it in, and also it keeps people out, right? So you couldn't just come in. Only the elites or the ruling class could enjoy this, or whom they deemed worthy to, right? And literally Muhammad Ibrahim talked actually quite extensively about that, how in the dynastic time, it's evident, again, based on the geology and the architecture added later, how this was sealed off to the public and only used for the ruling class. So Isis temple, this was probably, in a way, it was one of my favorite sites because you're down there again towards Luxor, much further south of Giza. This is the most beautiful area of Egypt. Like the Nile River is so beautiful. All this granite rock outcroppings and palm trees are surrounding the area. And so this Isis temple is built on this incredible island in the middle of the Nile. So you can only get there by boat. And so it's quite a ride. I think I sent you a picture of it. As you're arriving by boat, you can see the dynastic architecture made of sandstone. Again, it's cool. It's amazing until you see something more amazing. And so inside Isis temple, and Isis, if you look at Egyptian history and Egyptology, mythology, Isis was known as a great healer, the inventor of science. And so I think Isis even means place of birth. So again, fertility, it's talking about energy, consciousness. According to Muhammad, the base floor of the site's constructed of rose granite, again, contains 20 to 60% quartz, almost making it radioactive. The walls are made of sandstone, which contains sand and salt. It's absorbing negative energy. And this is why it's, again, considered a healing center. But you walk into the kind of like the Holy of Holies of this temple, and you see something that really stands out. Again, it's kind of like going to Machu Picchu. You see all the Inca stonework, which is cool, but it's made of small, rough stone and clay mortar. And then you see the white granite megaliths, and they're two separate things. Same thing here. You walk in, you see the sandstone and the hieroglyphs and the depictions of the pharaohs, and it's awesome. And then you see, and I sent you guys the picture there. I'd love to see your take on it. This megalith, it almost looks like an altar. It's cut straight from rose granite. Mm-hmm. It's got a flat top. And this thing was most likely, according to Muhammad and others, like an energy charging base, similar to maybe a lithium battery charger, where the ancients would bring maybe a granite piece, an artifact, even a statue, and they would place it on there to charge it. Again, we're talking geology. And then they would take that artifact to their other temple or to their other site in order to activate it with healing energy for the ancients. What do you guys think of that picture?
That's cool. It's crazy looking.
I mean, it's just, is it the box, the perfect looking box, and then the round charging stones?
Yeah.
What you're talking about? Yeah.
Well, this is...
It just looks different. It looks like it's just out of place. It's like the things, it doesn't match the surrounding walls, right? It's like the thing.
Yeah, this in this picture, Nate, there's people kind of surrounding it, and it's like coming up through a wooden floor they've built around it.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, there it is. What do you think about like some of the like a lot of New Age stuff talks about energy healing and crystals and stuff like that?
Quartz. Yeah, I went to Sedona last year, and they talk about quartz, and like they were even claiming UFOs charge on on this mountain in Sedona made of it's like 98% quartz.
Mm-hmm. The energy stuff gets real New Age real fast.
It's really strange. Yeah,
it's interesting you bring that up because we had such a great tour group on this trip, but it was all walks of life. We had young, old. We had people with all different worldviews, but what united us was our love for ancient history and megaliths, right? So all these
Bigfoot,
people were,
right?
That's right. all these people, they were critical thinkers. But what actually jumped out to me, there were some very wealthy people on this trip, very successful life. And so being around some of them, some of the phraseology and words I kept jumping out was manifesting. And they'd be like, yeah, I manifested that. Again, what some would say that's very New Age verbiage, right? And so in getting to know these people and hearing their stories, it was fascinating. And this dovetails, Luke, to what you were asking, and you too, Nate, about the New Age, geology and crystals and stuff. These people don't have a biblical worldview. They're not believers, right? But they're highly successful, highly wealthy, and they're talking about stuff that almost sound like spiritual disciplines, right? They're talking about manifesting, which is believing right. It's speaking into existence what you want. It's meditation time, quiet time, fasting. And I'm sitting here going, this is crazy, right? Mm-hmm. Not believers, but seeing some incredible results by doing what believers are told to do, right? With God, the original power source. And so it was eye-opening and challenging in a good way for me, because I come from a biblical worldview and I'm a believer. And to go, man, if there's people that have, more of a disciplined spiritual life than me and a lot of believers without God, man, we should be how much more abundantly can we live with God, exercising these spiritual disciplines that he created, right? That he's the author of. And so again, back to the ancients, I think it was very similar. Even if they didn't know God, they were critically thinking enough to understand the power, and whether or not they gave him credit as the creator, they were critical thinking enough to tap into the power the way God made it, right? The geology, the magnetism. And unfortunately, where a lot of people go wrong is they start to worship that stuff, right? It's kind of like astronomy versus astrology. It's okay to study the cosmos and the stars as long as you're not worshiping them.
Or it's just it's access, right? It's the idea that like we're told there's a proper way to access the spiritual realm, and it'd be prayer, even fasting, and then you see there's ways and that's manipulated in the other direction where we're not meant to. It's the wrong pathway, right? It's like the idea of mediums or whatever it may be. It's like the perversion of the pathway. It's interesting to hear you say that, because that is what it is. It's like, here's a way to talk about accessing the spiritual plane, talk about meditating. We're supposed to meditate on the word of God day and night, right? Meditate on these things are meant to be ways to access God and in the proper pathways, and yet they are skewed, right? You have this skewing or this perversion of the proper way.
The thing I like about oftentimes in the Old Testament, Jarek, is that you have these empires, and then you have a dude that's like 5'0" with a stone and a sling, and he rolls in and takes it out. That, yeah, I think God wants to bless human beings, but oftentimes God's way is so humble, and it must frustrate these dynasties that they build these empires, they make them earthquake proof, and it's like, well, I got other plans. See ya. And so many of these dynasties are just wiped out, by a boy with a sling. There's something about the spiritual life and the way that God asks us to live. It's so much more humble and so much more like almost basic, I think. But that's just my thoughts when you were.
No, that's well said. That is well said. And you see, we haven't really talked about cataclysm a whole lot, but whether it's Tennis or Elephantine Island, I mean, you'll see literally these megaton megalithic blocks. We haven't even talked about Elephantine Island yet, but we can do that in a future show. You see these megaliths literally ripped apart. It's not just like a wall toppled. They were ripped apart. You see literal like fire scorch marks on these statues. And so kind of, again, alluding to what you're saying, it looks like there was definitely some crazy cataclysm that hit. And it doesn't look like it was just your everyday earthquake. I mean, it was fiery, hot, ripping apart of megaliths. So interesting to think about. I guess one of the biggest takeaways from this trip, I knew going into this trip that, the pyramids were clearly, I believed, not built by the dynastics, that they were much older than 4,500 years old, as mainstream Egyptology would tell us. But I assumed that, most of the other stuff, save for a few megalithic temples, were all built by the dynastics. And so that was the biggest surprise. And again, I got to give credit to our guide, Muhammad Ibrahim, renowned Egyptologist and tour guide, for really pointing out that so much of it is megalithic. You don't only have the pyramids, but you've got these megalithic temples that were made by the same builders of the pyramids. You've got these obelisks that were made by the same builders of the pyramids. And the obelisk at Karnak that is still standing, if we still have time, we'll talk about that. Incredible. But then the greatest surprise of all was that all over Egypt are these statues. You see the dynastic statues. They're cool. They're made of sandstone usually, but they're made in sections. But you can literally see what look like megalithic statues, whether it's the one I referenced at the Ramesseum that's 1,000 tons, or look at the picture I sent you guys from Karnak of the torso, the waist and the legs of this megalithic statue. The picture doesn't even do it justice how big this thing was, but I believe what we're looking at there, it literally is the torso representation of the megalithic builders. That blew my mind. That we actually have pieces of statues we can see that were literally, some of them look 3D. If you look at the statue bust from Tanis, it's got muscle tone. It looks like it's been 3D printed. You compare that to a lot of the dynastic statues, and they're not the same. One is crude, one is 3D printed. Again, this torso at Karnak, these giant legs of a Titan look like they were 3D printed. You walk around the side and you see muscle tone in the thighs. That was the most incredible surprise of this trip, is that I believe we also have megalithic statues, likely from the same builders of the pyramids.
Yeah, I mean,
awesome.
it'd be wild to be back there and just see stuff's probably floating in the middle of the air. You had giants walking around. You probably it would probably look like a futuristic sci-fi movie if you could go back and look at what it really was like, just walking around.
That's the last question, Derek, is that in timeline, we of course also come from a biblical worldview. We've talked about this, but like, do you think that the megalithic is that watcher period technology? Do you think that stops with the flood, and then we have Moses interacting with Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, being those dynastic Egyptians repurposing these megaliths? And what do you think about that, Derek? What do you think about, like, if you were to timeline this based on our understanding from the biblical worldview, and then also technology-wise, right? Like, we talk about a cataclysm and it sort of ending the golden age or ending this megalithic building age, and then we would assume that even the Deuteronomy 32, right? The dividing of the nations, and there's the Elohim, the gods, the sons of God are put over these. And I would assume, trying to look backwards, how do you think it timelines based on the geology and based on the megalithic, record?
Great question, Luke. And I've really been thinking about this and doing some study because, again, as a believer coming from a biblical worldview, I've really been stretched coming back from this trip and trying to piece all of this together and comprehend these timelines. Again, we talked about the Sphinx and what is almost, I believe, unequivocal evidence that this thing is 10,000 BC. That's where it's coming from. And let me just say real quick, many people have said, well, it can't be that old. The dynastics built it. Look at the head. It looks like a pharaoh. But again, if you look at that from an aerial view, a drone's eye view, you'll notice the head of the Sphinx is much smaller than its body.
Yeah.
And so what happened is the original head, again, 12,000 years ago, it's been severely weathered and eroded. And so again, repurposed is the key word. The dynastics repurposed it, recarved that head to look like, a pharaoh, and that's why it's much smaller. So you've got that stuff going on. We've got Göbekli Tepe that we talked about, which this is like 11,500 years old or 12,000 years old, right? We've got Plato talking about Atlantis going back to 11,600 years ago. So how can all this be, especially for a lot of believers who come from a creationist, which I am, but a lot of believers are coming from a young earth point of view, right?
Right.
There's the flat earthers and then there's the young earthers.
Right.
And I was one of those for years. Again, the more I research, the more I'm opening my mind to a different timeline. So let me get to that. Yeah. So again, we've got mainstream history telling us that Earth and life was created by a big bang millions of years ago, right? But then they tell us that nothing interesting happened like the pyramids until just 4,500 years ago. Does anybody really believe that? I certainly don't, right? And then we have a lot of believers or creationists, of whom I'm one, who believe in a young earth of just about 6,000 years old. And so a lot of them are listening right now, having a hard time reconciling this dating we're talking about. So yeah, let's talk about that real quick. So I like to go back to Genesis, right? Back to the beginning.
Well, I was gonna point out when you do this is that there isn't really a timeline, right? We've got Genesis 5, which is the lineage of Adam, and then we have Genesis 6, and there's 5 verses between the incident at Mount Hermon and Noah finding favor in the Lord, but we don't know how long that time period was. I mean, this is what I think is fascinating, is that, and I'll let you continue, but I wanted to say, like, we're not given a lot of, like, in Genesis 6, how much time period passed there, right?
Yeah, I'll agree with you. I don't think we can just say 100% without a doubt, the earth is only 6,000 years old, but that is the time frame that most people subscribe to, is 6,000 years, that creation happened 6,000 years ago. So let's just go with that for fun, okay? For the sake of this. So we go to Genesis 1:1. Those famous words, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. If you do a quick concordance search of this verse, in the beginning, God created, that word created is the Hebrew word bara, I believe, or bara. And if you look up its meaning, it means to create, to make. It also means to make fat, like this is illustrious, this is finished. And then another word it means is done, like finished. So in the beginning, God created, bara. He created, he made it fat, it's done. Okay. That's Genesis 1:1. Genesis 1:2. Oh, also let me say that word bara is the same word that God uses in verse 21 and 27 to describe God creating animals and humans. Bara, he made them fat, he finished them, they're done. Okay, I'll come back to that in a minute. So we've got Genesis 1:1. It looks like, based on the Hebrew, that God made it good, it's done, it's ready. Okay, we jump to Genesis 1:2. It says, now the earth was without form and void. Darkness was over the surface of the earth, ... If you do a concordant search of this, look at the Hebrew, look at the term without form and void. That's 2 Hebrew words. I think they're pronounced tohu and bohu. And these words mean to lie waste, a desolation, desert. Adverbially, it means vain, vanity, confusion. In fact, it means vain 4 times, vanity 4 times, confusion 3 times. Without form is only 2 times. Wilderness is 2 times, and empty place is once, waste is once. So when you read this in the Hebrew, it kind of changes your picture, right? Like before I started studying this, when I would read the earth was without form and void, I'm kind of just picturing this black blob that's kind of ebbing and flowing. But when I look at the Hebrew for without form and void, tohu and bohu, it's more clearly saying desolation, desert, vain, vanity, confusion. Okay. So my question to people listening, especially to those who believe in a young earth theory, is why does verse 1 paint such a different picture than verse 2? Again, verse 1, in the beginning, God created, bara. He made it fat, it's done. It's a desolate desert. It's vain, it's confused, it's empty. Those are 2 different things. Right? And also,
we've talked a little bit about this, Derek, like with I'd say my memory serves me right, like specifically with Tim Alberino, and he has a theory that the earth was void and destructive because there had been a battle there, and it was completely desolate and demolished, and like you say that. So there, we've heard, we've talked a bit in some platitudes about this, and I think it's fascinating too because there isn't any specific time period there either, right? So there's a ton of leeway for time periods, for years and eons, and whatever you want to call it. So it's interesting, like.
Yeah, and so that leaves that brings me to a couple of questions. Now, one is, God using the same word bara that he created the universe in is the same word that he's using to create animals and humans. So when we think of God speaking animals and humans into existence, we're just thinking it's done. God spoke at the done. The animal is there. The cow is standing there. The Adam is done, right? So why would God use that same word to describe earth? He says is done. Oh, but wait, now it's not. Now it's still in process, right? It's empty, it's void. To me, that doesn't quite make sense. So could it be kind of like you were just saying, Luke, with your other discussions with Tim or others, that God created the universe, which I totally believe he did, the heavens and the earth in 6 days, but did he do it at a time much further back than 6,000 years? Was it 50,000 years? Was it 100,000 years? 500,000 years? And did the fall of the vain one, Lucifer, from heaven have something to do with the earth becoming vain and void in verse 2, right? Does that have something to do with the fall? And is the creation account in verse 2, is that actually the start of the current frame of history for humans that we're living in now rather than the creation of all time and things? And then that leads me to, did pre-Adamic life or civilizations once exist that could have possibly created prehistoric structures before Genesis 1-2? So lots of room there.
Lots of room. No, I think it's all very interesting to think about. Like, there's people that talk about Adam and Eve being booted from the garden and there being other people, and there not being a specific timeline there. So were there other people outside the garden? There's a lot of places you can go with that. And I think at the very end, really at the end of the day, right, I think the record continues to validate the Bible. Like, I think it continues to validate the Bible, and young earth, old earth, it doesn't matter where you land, like, we can go and point to things and touch things like you did in Egypt that point to a golden age there where we find in the Bible. We find it, we find it there. We find an influx of technology. We find, and then we also, perhaps there is things that happen pre-Adamic, and we haven't really unwrapped a ton of that or really much of that on the show, other than sort of like talking about, what happened in the fall of heaven and what happened with the rebellion and the war in heaven and when did that happen, and then Job talks about how the angels cried for joy at the creation or at the creation of the earth, and there's a lot of bunny trails or at least threads you can pull that pull back to to things being older and civilizations of technologically advanced civilizations predating very much predating at least this mainstream narrative that we have pushed, that these things were all dynastic Egyptian creations, and yet we can't figure out how replicate or do any of the any of the craftsmanship or moving of these giant stones that were done by purportedly the dynastic Egyptians, which we've kind of proved, I think, in this show, at least provided evidence for, laid out a case for, drastically predate dynastic Egypt.
Drastically, yes. I like that. They drastically predate the dynastics. And one other thing regarding how they possibly move these, we were getting into some great discussions with Muhammad and some of the others on our tour about lev trains. So again, Muhammad talked about how there's all kinds of guards and archaeologists who talk about these giant tunnels they find. And again, when you're looking at the distance and the spacing from Giza to Aswan, 11 hours, how did they move these? Again, mainstream says, well, they were just moving them on boats. Again, you look at the size of the unfinished obelisk. You really believe they were sledding that onto a boat in the water.
Right. Yeah.
There's no way that could float. And so did they have some kind of lev train, again, not in a new age sense per se, but geology, magnetics, using stone underneath that could somehow move the stone along with ease? I really haven't looked into that too much, but that was definitely interesting discussions.
Yeah. Well, buddy, it's been a pleasure. Very, very much so to talk about your trip. And I know that like you can't possibly unwrap almost 2 weeks in Egypt in an hour and a half. But we love having you on. We need to have you come back, and we need to dive into some of these things even further. But we appreciate you and your friendship and the community here in this space. Yeah, why don't you plug for a minute here? Tell people about. I'm sure they know, but it's always good to get it out there and talk about what you're working on, where they can find you, potential. You said you have more trips planned in the future here, so love to get that information out as well, Derek. Yeah,
appreciate it. Yeah, we do have a couple trips in the works for 2023. Looking at going to Egypt again in May of next year, so around this time. So that's coming up, and kind of breaking it on this show, looking at a Peru trip in early October of next year with Brian Forrester. And so that could be pretty awesome. So we'll be releasing that as soon as it's official, all over megalithicmarvels.com. You can find us again on Instagram. We're now on TikTok, Twitter, Facebook page, and group. So just look for Megalithic Marvels. You'll find us, and we'll be releasing all that info about the tours when it's official. But also, follow us. I'm getting into more kind of long videos. So that's what I'm working on now, is just doing some more kind of 10-minute videos, doing more teaching with photos and some videos of our trips, of some of the Egyptian sites or my past Peru visits. So excited about that. Excited about getting into more education. For a long time, it's just been Instagram and Reels, and I love all that. But it's kind of cool to put some more time and energy into creating videos and seeing that open mind. So
some long form. I love it. Drill holes, saw marks, laser cut precision. Derek Olson, Megalithic Marvels. Thanks for being here, brother. Appreciate you as always.
Hey, thanks, Luke, Nate.
Yeah, buddy.
You guys are amazing. We'll talk later.
Appreciate you.